Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for being here. It's a great honour and quite a responsibility, actually, to be doing this event to mark the 60th anniversary of the British election study. It was 60 years ago, next month, that Harold Wilson led the Labour Party to victory in the 1964 general election with, it was a narrow victory, but on 44% of the vote. And that seems now quite remarkable when you think that Keir Starmer just won a huge landslide with a mere 34% of the vote. But for me, that wasn't the most remarkable thing about 1964 general election. For me, that was the first election covered by the British Election Survey. So tonight I'm going to give a short-ish history of the study, and then go on to talk a little bit about how we've seen a realignment in voting behaviour. And by realignment, I mean a change in the fundamental relationship between social characteristics, social and demographic characteristics, and how people vote over time, and the role that Brexit has played in that realignment. And then I'm going to go on to say something about the 2024 general election, of course, and, well, I suppose how that realignment has survived in the face of a very different set of electoral circumstances in 2024. All of the work that I'm talking about today is done by the whole of the British Election Study team. So Jane Green, Stuart Perrott, Jeff Evans, Chris Prosser, Jack Bailey, and also John Mellon and James Griffiths. You moved, James. My visual cue was removed. And John Mellon, who couldn't be here today. But I also wanted to mention two members of the original British Election Study team that were on the team from when we set out in 2014 until 2019, and that was Kees van der Eyck, who's also with us, and Herman Schmidt, who's not here today. So the work I'm talking about is based on the work of the team, and they'll be here to talk later. So, if we cast our minds back, or for some of us our imagination, back 60 years to 1964, Harold Wilson famously said, if a week is a long time in politics. So if a week is a long time, what about 60 years? If you were back in 1964, and instead of looking forward to now, you were looking back, that would take you to 1904. So Queen Victoria's just died. It's before the Great War. It's before full female suffrage. So a lot's changed in those 60 years. But arguably, a lot has changed in the last 60 years since then also. We've seen a huge change in the nature of work and the number of women in the workforce. We've seen large-scale deindustrialization and a change in the social class structure. We've seen a massive expansion of higher education and an 8-fold increase in the number of people getting degrees. And of course, there's been vast international migration, which has made British society much more diverse than it was before. And of course, we also, in 1964, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have social media, and even like TV as an instrument for political communication was still in its relative infancy. So much has changed, but throughout that period, the British Election Study has monitored how voters have thought and behaved during that time. So, for example, political scientists will argue that we've seen voters become more critical, more likely to vote on the basis of the issues of the day or their evaluations of party leaders, and perhaps less driven by class loyalties or partisan attachments. In fact, most would agree that voters have become more likely to switch parties between elections and have become less attached, psychologically attached to those parties. Anyway, during this time, the British Election Study has been effectively a constant presence, and it continues to ask, or has asked throughout the period, it's asked voters about their attitudes about issues, their evaluations of party leaders and political parties. and it's asked about their personal, economic and social circumstances. And all this to understand why they vote the way they do, or if indeed they vote at all. Moving on to the next slide, I think, if I can just... Oh dear, that was not working. Yeah, this clicker's not working, but it's okay. So anyway, while the Nuffield election studies back in the 1940s and 50s transformed the study of electoral politics in Britain, Britain wasn't the first country to have a nationally representative survey of voters. That honour goes to the United States. The American National Election Study started in 1952. But it was one of the members of that ANES team, Donald Stokes, pictured on the left. No, is he on the left? He's on the right. Joined up with David Butler of Nuffield College, Oxford, to start work on political change in Britain. So that was back in 1963. So why, you may ask, are we celebrating this anniversary in 1964? Well, the answer, of course, is that the 2024 general election marks the 60th anniversary of general elections covered by the British Election Study. And this makes it the second oldest, I think, as I think Paul said, the second oldest national election study in the world, and I think it's the longest running social science academic survey in the UK. Now, since 1969, the British Election Study has been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and it's become an integral part of the UK's social science data infrastructure. And I think I speak on behalf of all the BES users and the wider political science community in saying that we're very grateful for that level of support throughout the years. Over those years, the study's kind of expanded in its kind of scope and size from its original kind of pre-post-election design to include various different components, including multi-wave panels running across the whole electoral cycle, but also separate studies in Scotland and Wales, and also sporadic, perhaps too sporadic in some people's opinion, ethnic minority election studies. Still no luck with that. So over the years, the British Election Study has moved location in terms of the host organisations from Nuffield College, Oxford to Essex, back to Nuffield, and in 2014 to the Manchester-based consortium, which also involves Nuffield, and also the University of Nottingham between 2014 and 2019, and Royal Holloway since 2019. And the major book from each of these studies are pictured here, and I think this, for me, it captures the kind of diversity and the massive contribution British Election Study teams have made to understanding electoral behaviour, both in Great Britain and more widely. And I'm delighted to see we have some of the authors of some of these books here today. But each of these books has made an important contribution, but it's important to say also that they're built on the knowledge and learning of the previous studies. And when I was struck by a passage, I was looking back at political change in Britain, that's the Butler and Stokes book on the top right, and I was taken by the passage, the following passage: in searching for remedies to the perennial problems of economic growth, of national solvency, of inflation and of industrial unrest, ministers, whatever their party and whatever they may have said in opposition, have turned in succession to similar answers. In such circumstances, it is not surprising that there's been a secular decline in the sense of party difference. So that could just so easily have been written in 2024 as in the 1960s. One of these books, that's interesting. we seem to have lost... oh, you're back. Perhaps you have to move slides quickly. One of these books, How Britain Votes, that's the yellow book on the top row, and I'm pleased to see we have both John Curtis and Anthony Heath here today, co-authors of this book. This book was my personal introduction to psephology when I was studying for a degree at the University of Sheffield. I was the sole geography politics dual honours degree in my year, and as such I was asked basically to run my own module, which was writing an essay or dissertation on a topic of my own choosing. And inspired by this book, I wrote a dissertation on the geography of voting under Thatcherism in the 1980s. And that inspired me to go on and do a PhD on the very same topic under Ron Johnson, back when the BES was a mere 23 years old, which does age me, clearly. But my thesis was essentially that economic voting under Thatcherism changed the relationship between where we live and how we vote. But this also had a knock-on impact in terms of the level of class voting, because economically satisfied working class voters in the south of England, which was very affluent under Thatcherism, were much more prepared to vote Conservative, were much more supportive of free market economics than the working class in the more deindustrialised north. So the lesson, which I think is relevant to what I'm talking about today, is that the political strategy of Thatcher was crucial to the relationship between social characteristics, demographic characteristics, geography and vote choice. So to understand alignment and realignment, we don't just have to understand the voters, but also to understand the supply side, the political parties. So just as regional class de-alignment in the 1980s reflected different levels of support for free market economics, I'm going to argue that the strategic positioning of parties around Brexit is a crucial element of why Brexit catalysed the realignment of British voters and why that remains important today. In electoral shocks, which is the bottom left, I'm getting my lefts and right mixed up because I'm looking at the screen. But in electoral shocks, we showed how an increasingly de-aligned electorate and political shocks combined to create greater electoral volatility. And at the time, 2015 was the most volatile election on record since we were able to measure individual level volatility, by which I mean the percentage of people switching from one party to another between elections. And we looked at how parties' responses to these to electoral shocks drove that volatility, and particularly looking at shocks like the financial crisis, the Scottish independence referendum, and of course Brexit. And we continue the story of one of these shocks in our forthcoming book of Oxford University Press, which is due out next year, all going well. Realignment, how Brexit reshaped British voting behaviour, as Paul mentioned. Now, in this, we pick up the story really about how electoral shocks don't just cause volatility, but they also can precipitate realignment because of how parties respond to how parties responded to Brexit and how that affected different groups of voters. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I think it'll be about 20 minutes or so by now, I'll show how Brexit has reshaped the relationship between vote choice and social class and education and geography and political values. And the question that I really kind of want to address is, did Brexit usher in a realignment, and is that still surviving? And the answer is complicated. Essentially, I mean, the realignment didn't begin and end with the referendum in 2016, clearly. But you'll see that the realignment was actually rapidly accelerated by the referendum result. And then I'll go on to look at the 2024 election and particularly show that the alignment has survived despite the collapse in the Conservative share of the vote. So, I'm going to look first at the period 2015 to 2019, because this is when a lot of what I'm calling Brexit-based sorting actually took place. And what I mean by sorting is voters lining up behind the party that best represented their Brexit preferences. So that meant people who supported Brexit increasingly lined up behind the Conservatives, and people that supported Remain lined up behind Labour. And the kind of peak for that was 2019, but I'll come to that. But the question is how did that affect alignments? And I'm going to show you if I can move on, I'm going to show you a graph which is basically reporting an index of alignment that Jack Bailey and I designed specifically for trying to measure alignments for different kinds of variables over a long period of time where the data is quite messy. So it's quite simplified, and this is the kind of two-party alignment, if you like. This looks at the relative probabilities of voting for Conservative and Labour, but as you'll see later, that can be extended to include other parties, which I do. But the key thing here really is on the x-axis, or on the y-axis, sorry, you've got a number. The absolute value of the number is not that important, but the higher it is, the kind of more important or stronger the alignment is. And while the absolute value isn't hugely important, what I want you to look at really is the relative importance of the different categories, and also, perhaps more importantly, the trends. And the key trends I want you to note are the long-term decline in the strength of the class alignment, that's the red line, and the sharp increase in the strength of the age alignment since 2015 in particular, that's the navy line, and the recent reversal of the education alignment, that's the orange line. And when I say reversal, I mean these alignments are based on, essentially they're anchored on what the relationship between these variables was back in the 1960s. So in the case of education, you see that the relationship has completely reversed, which means rather than Conservatives being more likely to be more highly educated, they're relatively more likely to be less likely to be highly educated. So that particular alignment is reversed, whereas the age alignment has increased quite dramatically in importance. Now, in the book, we argue that these changing alignments are linked to, these long-term changes at least, are linked to changes in the impact of values, and in particular, a rising importance of liberal authoritarian values. And I'm particularly talking not about how those values have changed, but more about how they map onto voting. And this is a slide that Chris Prosser created. And what I want to draw out here really is, this is showing a plot showing for England only, the positive effect on the y-axis indicates that more authoritarian values being positive is associated with an increase in likelihood of voting for the party in question, so blue being Conservative, red Labour, and so on. So what you see is that Conservatives throughout the period have been, Conservative voters throughout the period have been more authoritarian, while Labour voters are more liberal, not surprisingly. But what you see also is that relationship becomes much stronger after 2015. So you see this kind of fanning out. And we make the link here between, as I'll go on to make the link here between this kind of changing impact of values with the Brexit referendum. So my next question really is, why did the alignment accelerate after 2016? And this argument has three basic steps. So the first step is that the referendum triggered this Brexit-based sorting I was referring to. And you can see that in this chart, which shows the percentage support for Leave and Remain amongst Conservatives and amongst Labour voters. And what we're seeing here is that before the referendum, Conservative voters in particular were quite mixed. They were pretty evenly distributed between people who supported EU membership and people who didn't. And what happened after the referendum is this changes quite suddenly, so that Leave voters increasingly back the Conservatives, whereas Labour is more increasingly likely to be supported by Remainers. And you can see that that gets wider and wider over time during this period. Now, the second step of the argument is that social and demographic characteristics. Have I lost sound? No. Yeah. That social and demographic characteristics, especially age and education, are very highly related to Brexit preferences. And this was incredibly stable over the time, right? So there's not a big change. Young people don't suddenly become more Remainy and so on. That's incredibly stable. And I'm not going to show you that because I think we're all familiar. But so the third step of the argument is simply that the sorting process, because there are very different proportions of Leavers and Remainers in different sections of the population, the electoral sorting pulls certain types of voters towards Conservatives, like the older voters, the more socially conservative voters, essentially the pro-Brexit voters, and it pulls the younger voters, the more educated voters, towards Labour. So there's this knock-on effect of this Brexit divide. So anyway, why did this sorting happen? Which I haven't really addressed yet, but very briefly, and will be covered in much more detail in the book, obviously, but very briefly, it's about political supply. So the referendum increased the salience of immigration and EU membership. It also changed perceptions of the competence of parties to deal with immigration. But it also forced parties to make strategic decisions about which issues to prioritise and where they stood on EU membership. And so what you see as a result is that voters become clearer about where parties stand. And this chart shows on a scale running on the y-axis, which goes from 0, which is unite fully with the European Union, and 10, which is protect our independence from the European Union. So this shows perceptions of where the Conservatives stood in blue, where Labour stood in red, and where respondents positioned themselves in grey. And it's split by whether the respondent is supported Remain or Leave. So essentially what you see, and the main actions on the Conservative side, is that after the referendum you see a sudden and massive increase up until 2017 in perceiving the Conservatives to be an anti-European party. That obviously, well not obviously, but that falls off a bit after 2017 when the Brexit negotiations are going on and there's all these internal arguments about the deal. But then it recovers massively when the Conservatives appoint Boris Johnson as the leader and obviously as Prime Minister. So it's this changing perception of where the parties stand, which is driving that sorting. Now, so to summarise the period, 2016 to 2019, I'm talking about the referendum result, changing perceptions of where parties stood on Brexit. This causes them to sort into their various parties, and that causes the social and demographic alignments to change in its wake. So then we go forward. We skip forward to 2024. 4.5 years later, Brexit's done, and it's not really spoken of in the campaign. The combined share of the two major parties, combined share of the vote of the two major parties has plummeted, well, particularly the Conservative share of the vote. So how, in these circumstances, did the realignment survive? Well, first I'm going to show you that it did, and I'm going to extend the alignment graphic that I showed you earlier. So this is now extended using the BES panel data, which has an incredible 27 waves since 2014, and allows us to look in much more granular detail. And you can see really that, as I was showing you in the long-term chart, how particularly after the referendum, age in the navy blue became much more important. The role of class continued to decline and even go into reversal. And the education alignment went into reversal around the time of the referendum. But what I really wanted to pick out here was the incredible amount of stability in those alignments since 2019. So despite this massive change, you're seeing pretty much the same patterns of alignment by age, class, education, home ownership, and geography over this period. So how can that be? Well, it essentially is because the Brexit divide remains really strong. And you can see that in this chart. It's the same chart as before, but I've added the same index score, but for people's Brexit position, so whether they're a Leaver or a Remainer. Now, that is a bit unfair, and it's not strictly comparable because the others are social demographic positions. This is actually an attitude or opinion. But nevertheless, the effect is actually quite striking. So you see a very big increase in the Brexit divide after the referendum, then it tails off, as I mentioned, up until after the 2017 election, and then peaks with the Johnson Get Brexit Done election. But there is some decline after 2019 in that, but it's still, Brexit still is dividing voters as much as it was in 2017. And interestingly, you see that the social alignments that have followed Brexit have remained at their post-Brexit elevated positions. Now, the reason this is kind of slightly surprising for me is that 2024, according to our preliminary analysis at least, was the most volatile election on record since we've been able to measure individual level volatility when the British election study started running in 1964. And just to remind you, individual level volatility, I mean people switching between elections. And as you can see, this is at a peak in 2024. It decreased after 2015 as voters became more settled into their sorted Brexit positions, but now it's gone back up again. So why does the social alignment stay strong when it's become so much more volatile? And the answer is because of where people switched. So the following two charts are going to show how Leavers, or people who want to stay out, and Remainers, people who want to stay in, switched their vote between 2019 and 2024. So the left-hand side simply represents where they were in 2019, and the right-hand side where they... Sorry, I'm just getting my left and right wrong still. This side, near me, is 2024. So when we look at Leavers, well, you can see, you know this, right? So if you look at Leavers, yeah, you get some Leavers moving to the Conservatives, and you get some Conservative, so you get some Labour Leavers moving to the Conservatives, and vice versa. But what dwarfs all that is essentially the desertion of many Conservative Leavers to reform. It's just the predominant flow, which you can see here. It's the blue to green line running from left to right, whatever. Now we look at Remainers, and yeah, I mean, less going on, but essentially Labour's level of support amongst Remainers doesn't change very much. They are losing some supporters to the Greens, for sure. We can go into why that might have been at the end, perhaps. But crucially, they are losing and gaining from the Liberal Democrats in kind of equal proportions. And if you look into where those places, where they're losing those votes, it's whichever party was best placed to defeat the Tories. So Labour voters are going to the Liberal Democrats in seats where the Liberal Democrats were in first or second place and most likely to beat the Tories, and the reverse in seats where Labour were in first or second place. So there's clearly a strategic shifting of voters on the Remain side. So what these tell me is that there's a clear desire to remove the Conservatives from power on both sides of the Brexit divide. But this change was asymmetric. The Leave voters are doing one thing and the Remain voters are doing something else. And so if we think about this in terms of what we call party families instead of just individual parties, we can see that the level of volatility is actually very low, because voters are essentially staying with a party that's on their same side. So if we think about a right Conservative and pro-Brexit family, that would be Conservative and Reform, and you think about a Liberal left Remain party family, that would be Labour, Liberal Democrats, Greens, Scottish Nationalists, Plaid. I haven't forgotten anybody, I don't think. And essentially, voters are switching within those party families, not across them. Now, if we look at the level of sorting within and between party families, then this picture becomes clearer. So this diagram is essentially showing the percentage support for each party among Leavers and Remainers. So if you look first at the coloured lines, that's Conservative and Labour, you can see that massive drop in Conservative support amongst Leavers. They're also losing support amongst Remainers, but they're doing so from a much lower base. Labour, on the other hand, gaining a few, losing a few on both sides. So it's kind of a neutral picture. But what that means in terms of party families, and there's little squares and little stars here, but the stars are the Liberal and Left family, and the squares are the Conservative right family. What you see is that over this whole period, right back to 2014, this level of sorting has increased, but then it remains fairly stable after 2019, as voters have switched not between party families, but within them. Now, so what does this mean for the social alignments? Well, I've done one more revision to my alignment index scores, and this time we're looking at the same indices, including the Brexit one, but where the voters' positions are defined by which party family they're in, not by whether they're Labour or Conservative. So what we see now is that the Brexit divide increases quite rapidly and strongly after the referendum, and it only declines relatively modestly since 2019. And in terms of the social alignments, particularly the age in blue again and the education in yellow, orange and yellow again, they've remained pretty stable since, particularly since 2019. And they're at that kind of post-Brexit kind of elevated levels. So, to wrap up really, what does this mean for the future of electoral politics? Well, I would go up, but I don't know if I can. No, I can't. That's the end. Yeah. What does it mean for the future of electoral politics in Britain? I think electoral alignments are important to our party politics. They provide stability and structure to party competition. And as alignments change, parties are really forced to choose whether they seek to win back their erstwhile supporters, their traditional supporters, or whether to kind of double down on their new constituencies of support. And this is a risky and difficult decision. So will realignment survive in future elections? Or will we revert to voting around left-right because of increasing economic inequalities, or simply because the first past the post electoral system means that the role of the smaller parties becomes undermined? I've talked about the growing importance of socio-cultural values in predicting vote choice, especially since the referendum. And this doesn't show any sign of abating. The party's kind of strategic manoeuvring since 2016 referendum has involved parties taking more general positions around kind of socio-cultural issues, which kind of stand in for Brexit. They're not still talking so much about Brexit, but they're talking about issues which are very highly related around those social and cultural values. And I think by appealing to voters on those issues, particularly the Conservatives appealing to voters on the basis of, say, immigration and anti-woke messages, that serves to reinforce this new alignment. It's also likely that these new alignments will be reinforced by an increasing correlation between economic values and liberal authoritarian values, which has been actually going up over the last decade or so. So increasingly the two dimensions are intertwined. So you could see that, for example, in the way in which, say, older voters are both more economically conservative because of intergenerational wealth differences, perhaps, and they're also more socially conservative on traditional issues. So whether this persists obviously will depend on, well, not obviously, but it will depend on the strategic decisions of parties. So, for example, who the Conservatives choose as their next leader is likely to have an impact as parties take a position on these social and cultural issues. And, you know, I think, for what it's worth, I think that it's a risky thing to put all your eggs in that kind of, for the Conservatives to go for that right-wing authoritarian voter, if only because British society overall is becoming more liberal, and the socially conservative voters, anti-European voters, are gradually being replaced in the electorate by younger, more liberal, highly educated voters. So the pool from which they're drawing support is actually getting smaller, and at the same time they're facing stiffer and stiffer competition from reform. And even though that on the Remain side or the Liberal left side, the parties are fragmented, as I've just argued, they are capable of being ruthlessly inefficient in terms of how those votes are converted into seats. So as long as there's a common interest in keeping out the Conservatives, and as long as people are able to see understand the strategic position of the parties, then that's likely to continue. So I think as long as the Conservatives and Labour seek to appeal to their new bases of support, then this new alignment is likely to persist. So how long the British party system remains in the shadow of Brexit is, by definition, yet to be seen. But I think, and I hope, and I expect that that story will be told by future British elections, that is, perhaps for as long as another 60 years. Thank you.